because they know that he will honour the stories that they tell him. And I just want to say before we start the event that I just think that that is one of the things that is very remarkable about this place in general, but about journalists like Trevor and Barry in particular, is that they will tell stories. They will gather stories and they will tell stories, and they will not let any obstacle get in their way in doing that. And that takes incredible diligence, it takes incredible courage, and it's highly risky. And I just think that they deserve enormous credit for what they've done. And Trevor in particular for this fabulous book, which is available for sale at the top of the shop. It's a very strange story, as any of you who know the Lough Island story will be able to say. You know, it started out as an atrocity. It has ended up being a very, very bizarre story, which has revealed more in some ways about the history of the conflict here than anybody could have ever imagined it would at the time of the atrocity, when people were just deeply, deeply shocked by the appalling act that was perpetrated upon those 6 men and on that small community in County Down. But Trevor will be telling you a bit more about that whenever we sit down to talk about the book. But before that, I want to introduce our guest speaker here tonight, Noel Doran, who is formerly the editor of the Irish News and known to everybody here as somebody who also was a very, very brave journalist in his time in that role, and a person who didn't hesitate to tell stories even when he was strongly advised that he'd be better not to, shall we say. So Noel, if you would like to start off, and then we'll follow that with, I'm going to interview Trevor for about half an hour. But please, if you can't hear at the back, would you indicate that you can't so that we know to speak up a bit? Okay, so just welcome to Noel Doran now.
Thanks very much indeed, Susan, and I hope as many people as possible can hear me who have managed to get through the traffic here tonight. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, it's a great honour to be asked to speak to you tonight for a range of reasons, principally because we're marking the publication of an important new book, Shooting Crows, which addresses issues of the utmost seriousness for everyone in our society. Before I come to the main business of the evening, I just want to mention the geography of the launch. It's been in 2 parts. The first was in Lough Island last week, which was an emotional evening down there in the Heights Bar, and this is part 2. So we're here tonight in Waterstones of Fountain Street, which is itself one of Belfast's cultural hubs, squeezed in between 2 other key centres. The first of which is the Linen Hall, just on the other side of the wall here, which has been much more than a library, and indeed a place where ideas have been exchanged for almost 250 years. One of the people who was instrumental in its development was the late John Killen, somebody Susan would have known and many other people in this room would have known well. He was a member of staff there for 37 years, ultimately becoming chief librarian. He was the author of a number of books himself, and he was someone who wore his learning lightly up until his death just 2 years ago. Now, John was a son of Lough Island. He lived there his entire life. He was a pillar of Lough Island GAC. He was talented enough to represent Down in both football and hurling, and he was a man of many parts who would have been closely familiar with the events described in Shooting Crows. The other prominent building facing us just across the way here is of course the Fountain Centre, home these days to the Irish News, paper which I had the privilege of editing for a quarter of a century until earlier this year. As John Killen wrote books on political satire, would you believe, as well as Irish drinking habits, I'd like to think he would have been just as comfortable at the Irish News as he was at the Linen Hall. The other huge link between the paper and Lough Island was of course my great friend and mentor, the late Jim Fitzpatrick, chairman of the Irish News, who died in 2022 at the age of 92. He had quite an extraordinary career, not just in newspapers and in the law, but he worked with the leaders of church and state to make Ireland a better place. He was very proud of his roots, and of course his relatives have been prominent in the Lough Island area. For generations, their old family home was the famous Buck's Head House, which dates back to before 1798 and had historic links to the United Irishmen and the man from God knows where. So Loughin Island was always a special place in County Down and in wider terms. To get the shooting crows, which is why we're here tonight. It's an exceptional book by any standards. It's written by Trevor and it reflects his major collaboration with Barry over many years. I have to say in passing, there's been some talk about the touching bromance which is developed between Trevor and Barry. It is referred to in the book. It's bound to feature when a film eventually and inevitably follows. There have been quite a few great movies based on journalism. A few of my favourites, Defence of the Realm, I love that one. There was The Front Page, which despite some rumours was not set above the much missed Macklehattons of Donegal Street. Probably most memorably, there was All the President's Men, the celebrated tale of Watergate, starring Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman, which was also a wonderful bromance. And I think we can all see the parallels.
More come on my eyes, I think.
The question for Trevor and Barry is who most closely resembles Robert Redford. But with modern
Very obvious to all.
with modern technology, I wonder if Dustin Hoffman could play both of them. And I mean, more seriously, and to look at the book, I can say exactly where I was on June the 18th, 1994, because, like many others, I went to a bar to watch a football match on television that night. I was in Belfast, but there was a sense of unease in parts of the city, so our group decided against our normal haunts on the Ormer Road and felt that the Malone Road might be safer, so we went over to the Botanic Inn that night. The place was packed, it was a big occasion, it was a fantastic result for Ireland to beat Italy in the World Cup. We all celebrated afterwards, but as the evening wore on, one of the barmen said to me he had heard there was a shooting somewhere out in the country and there were people dead. Mobile phones were in their infancy, so there were few other details, but it was clear something dreadful had happened and the crowd drifted off quietly. Now, we were lucky, we got home safely. The people in the Heights bar were quite the opposite, and by the next day, the grim details were in wide circulation and the trauma was only beginning for the relatives and the friends of the dead. Adrian Rogan, Malcolm Jenkinson, Barney Green, Daniel McCrainer, Patrick O'Hare, Eamon Byrne, and all the wounded. There was so much evidence about what happened and so much knowledge about those responsible that there was an obvious expectation that they would be swiftly brought before the courts. However, as the days turned into months and years, it became clear that the gunmen and their associates were being protected, and we were looking at a deeply malign but not unfamiliar scenario. I've been asked to speak at 2 book launches in the last month. This is the second, but the first was for Ghosts of a Family. Some people were at that one in the Wallabies last month. It was written by the leading Dublin historian Edward Burke about the notorious massacre of Owen McMahon and his family at Kinnaird Terrace in North Belfast in 1922. There are striking parallels between the two atrocities. Both of them speak directly to the relationship between the Northern State and its national citizens. They each involve the shocking murder of 6 innocent Catholic civilians during periods of great tension, just over 70 years apart, and in both cases, no prosecution ever followed. It's abundantly clear that the chief and the key perpetrators were shielded by sections of the authorities, with the McMahon murderers confident enough to wear their special constabulary uniforms when they carried out the shootings. Edward Burke conclusively named the main organiser and gunman from Kinnaird Terrace as David Duncan, who, as it happens, came originally from just the other side of Saintfield, not far from Loughin Island, and who was subsequently protected just as carefully as the guilty parties from the Heights bar. Duncan was facilitated in joining the French Foreign Legion, disappeared off to Tunisia, before he was eventually provided with first-class travel on a luxury liner to Canada, where he later died in a mental hospital. The term collusion began to appear for what seems to have been the first, but sadly not the last occasion after Kinnaird Terrace. And there's no doubt that just after 7 decades later, precisely the same description must be applied to Loughin Island. It goes without saying that all killings are not only wrong, but cruel, dreadful, and capable of causing only misery and bitterness on a huge scale, whether they happened in 1922, 1994, or at any other time, and whether they were linked to loyalists, Republicans, or official agencies. However, it also needs to be said that the first duty of a state is to protect its citizens, and if there is the slightest hint that it instead played any form of role in their deaths, it becomes a matter of fundamental concern to all of us. We can say without doubt that collusion at many different levels contributed directly to the scandal of Loughin Island, and the full circumstances are set out with precision in this outstanding book. Trevor and Barry worked tirelessly with the families on Loughin Island. They carried out a massive research project, travelling extensively, including to France and to the United States. The trip to France is certainly worth describing, and it's all set out in the book. It ensured that the entire devastating story could be told for the first time through their acclaimed 2017 documentary, No Stone Unturned. When they identified and named those who planned and carried out the slaughter, it was a major breakthrough, and it should have at long last paved the way for the full force of the law to deliver convictions. Incredibly, the arrests which took place in 2018 were instead those of Trevor and Barry, and they found themselves taken into police custody and questioned about serious offences which could have resulted in their imprisonment. That was definitely the intention of the Durham Constabulary. There was also the alleged theft of material from the Police Ombudsman's Office and possible breaches of Britain's Official Secrets Act. It was all both entirely ludicrous but hugely disturbing and concerning. It took another 2 years before they were fully exonerated and received comprehensive apologies, and of course the consequences are still being considered before the Investigatory Powers Tribunal in London, with some remarkable evidence being heard there even in recent weeks. The details are all in the book, which makes essential but chilling reading. And as I said in a message to Trevor when I had the opportunity to read an advance copy, it provides riveting insights into the way in which power can be abused in modern Ireland. At the heart of it is the simple reality that the entire legal saga has been played out time and time again between one court and another, without the individuals who pulled the triggers and whose identities are so well known ever finding themselves in the dock. Perhaps the justice which the families so badly deserve will never arrive, but the facts of the case have now been placed before the jury of public opinion, which is a significant step forward. And to conclude my thoughts this evening, there are indisputably some vital lessons for all of us from the book Shooting Crows. We always need good lawyers, some of them with us tonight, dotted around the room. They're needed to protect ordinary citizens and to prevent their rights from being ignored. So it's good to see them all along tonight. We always need good journalists, especially Trevor and Barry, to shine a spotlight in some uncomfortable directions and bring us somewhere closer to establishing the truth. However, most of all, we always need good people, the kind of people who will support victims, stand by their neighbours, and display courage in the face of the worst kind of adversity. That, I believe, is an accurate description of the people of Loughin Island, and that is why, even after evil visited the Heights Bar, there is still hope for the future of our country. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Noel. I think that was a very moving introduction to Trevor's book, and it's just quite extraordinary to hear the names of those 6 men read out in that way, because as you rightly noted, no one has been in any way punished for those terrible crimes except the two journalists who investigated them most fully. Trevor, you mention in the beginning of your book that everybody knows where they were when Loughlin Island happened. Where were you?
Well, actually, I was here in Belfast. In February 1994, I joined Downtown Radio, and by June, I was still really trying to find my legs in journalism in Belfast. I'd been working on the Partial Reporter for 10 years previously, and I'd moved from the rural tranquility of Fermanagh and Enniskillen, the most wonderful part of the country, under the editor and friend who's here tonight, Denzel McDaniel, and I had moved to Downtown Radio. And on the night of the murder, in fact, myself and my brother, who I think is here tonight, watched the match in a cricket club, believe it or not, off the Craiger Road, and in many ways because we thought that was one of the safest places to be. Noel said in Loughlin Island last week that you chose the Botanic Bar. And I think that in the days after the shooting on the Shankill Road, I think that everyone knew there was going to be some sort of retaliation, and that's the most incredible thing, that everyone knew there was going to be a retaliation, and the most obvious time for that retaliation was from the UVF was on the night of the Ireland-Italy match. So myself and my brother Nigel knew a guy who had the keys to this cricket club, and we went in there to watch it, and because we felt safe that night. And it was while we were there that, as somebody said today, everyone at that time will remember the police notices that come across the TV to say that there had been an incident in Loughlin Island. And I remember standing outside, and I think it was on a mobile, I can remember being outside on a mobile phone or something, and realising just the enormity of what had been visited, and just the predictability of the events that happened in Loughlin Island. Like, it was so predictable that something was going to happen that night. And actually being on the Falls Road earlier that day for Downtown Radio, speaking to bar owners and clubs about what security they were taking for that night, for the match. And there was this mixture of excitement, start of the World Cup in America, Ireland versus Italy, and then withdrawing away from it to try to be as far as away from the most predictable places. None of us could have predicted that Loughlin Island was going to be chosen. I hope what the book shows and what I write about is that it wasn't a random attack, that it was predictable to those who knew what the Southdown UVF and the gang that emerged out of the village of Clough, what they were capable of. And so I don't believe there was anything random about the events that took place on that night and that cost the lives of those 6 men.
Well, you've entered into that territory now about what this was about. Can you just tell us a bit about what the background to this incident was in terms of where the guns came from, where the instruction came from, where this gang came from? Because in many ways your book challenges a narrative that many people actually still believe about the Troubles, which is that it was a matter of these, sort of crazed gangs, cruising about, killing groups of people. And that actually doesn't emerge as having been the truth. And I think it's kind of important to say that a lot of people now are fully aware that there is a thing called collusion. But we were talking earlier, with some of the other journalists here about how, in the early 1990s, people were still discussing, what do you think about this collusion idea? Is it a real thing? Is it as widespread as some are saying? There was a lot of confusion and uncertainty about what actually was going on. There were a lot of things that didn't add up, but people were reluctant to think that there was a massive conspiracy involved. But really, as Noel said, your book does point to the fact that there was, doesn't it?
It does, and absolutely. And I think that, don't forget how polarised the communities were in the late 80s and early 90s. And no matter what one community said, the other community wasn't going to believe it. And the concerns that were coming out of the national community that there was some sort of collusion was probably treated with scepticism, and obviously the police forces were doing nothing to encourage any sense that there was collusion with loyalist paramilitaries. However, you know, and I can understand it as well, because you know, I come from a policing family. My father was an RUC reservist who was a born again Christian who saw going out on the RUC on a Friday and Saturday night as some sort of social occasion rather than something about serving Queen and country. So for many unionists, that was their experience of police officers who were going out like my father at a part-time, earn money, more money, bring home to their families. And this collusion thing was like, you know, what? You know, that some these people could be involved, and it couldn't be more further from what my father was and what he stood for. So I can understand it totally, in that there was a lot of scepticism. They were coming for unionism towards nationalism, but quite clearly there were people within nationalism could join the dots and could see that there was something much darker going on. That this wasn't something where, you know, like the early part of the Troubles in the late 60s and early 70s, that people were simply being shot dead because they were on the wrong side of the street at the wrong time, to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. By the time we got into the 90s, I do believe that there was a certain rhythm and a certain context to almost every death, particularly those that were conducted by the loyalist paramilitaries, because, you know, Sir John Stevens, when he investigated John Finucane's father's murder, found that over 90% or 95% of the people that he dealt with and he was examined within loyalist paramilitaries were agents of the state, or were informers or touts or whatever you want to call them. So, you know, there was a systematic nature to all of this. So the gang that ended up involved in Loughin Island in 1994 essentially emerged out of the murder of the very well known murder of Patrick Keelty, the television presenter's father, Jack Keelty, who was murdered in January 1988. And January 1988 was actually a very important time, and I think actually from November 1987 to January 1988 was an incredibly pivotal moment. Unknown to a lot of us. We did know the horror of Enniskillen that was perpetrated in my hometown in November 87, and we knew the impact that had, the horror around the world at the death of those innocents in Enniskillen. And we were all coming to terms with the scale of that attack by the IRA and the nature of the attack. And what we didn't know, that at that very moment there was a shipload of arms that was on its way from the Mediterranean and come into Northern Ireland through Warren Point or through Belfast in a shipload of tiles that had come out of Lebanon. And there was a whole nature, there's a whole background to that about South Africa and its war with Angola, and the Angolans were being supplied with MiG fighter jets, and the South Africans were trying to counteract these MiGs, and one thing led to another, and they found the Shorts missile that was being manufactured in East Belfast, and this was the way to take down these MiGs. So loyalism in South Africa got in contact. Brian Nelson was in the middle of it initially in 1985, but later it was Ulster Resistance that was born out of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and one thing led to another, and this shipload of arms came into Northern Ireland not long after the Enniskillen bomb, and everyone has an opinion about how that shipload arrived in. There are those out there who absolutely believe it was shipped in with the knowledge and support of MI5. There's others who believe that there was some other game going on, that RUC Special Branch weren't aware of it and only became aware of it. But it ended up on a farm in Mid-Ulster and was then broken apart, and these VZ-58 rifles that were Czech-made ended up in the hands of the UVF. The UDA lost a huge amount of their part. It was Ulster Resistance, UVF, and the UDA that basically had come together to. The bank was robbed. £250,000 at the very least was was raised to pay for these weapons. Anyway, the weapons came in and were split up at a guy called Mitchell's farm in Glenanne. And immediately the UDA lost their weapons. The REC stopped a car not far from Mitchell's farm and captured, everyone remember the images of the Granada burgundy cars laden down with these weapons. But yet, so many got through. UVF lost some of theirs as well. But in March 1988, which was a horrific month, a man called Michael Stone walked into Milltown Cemetery and fired a grenade as part of the attack on the...
Several grenades.
More hand grenade? Pardon?
Trevor, I'm going to actually make you fast forward a bit here
Yes.
because you're telling us
Anyway,
the
that
whole,
was the first weapon that was
story
fired.
of the book. And people can read all
I know,
this.
and that weapon ended up...
If you can just sort of tell us about that particular unit of the UVF and how they ended up getting some of those South African weapons.
Well, very clearly the weapon that was found in Milltown, the weapons very quickly found their way into the hands. From East Belfast, they were being shipped down because I think the people of East Belfast and the UVF realised there was a gang that emerged out of Jack Keelty's murder and they were willing to kill. And East Belfast UVF, Shankill Road UVF were willing to arm them. So the VZ-58 was supplied to them. There were handguns supplied to them and a series of attacks carried out, including one that cost the life of an individual called Martin Lavery in North Belfast and just before Christmas 1992. And this VZ-58 ended up in the hands of an individual called Ronnie Hawthorne, and Ronnie Hawthorne, who'd been in the UDR and had been responsible for many attacks up until 1994, and on the night of 18th of June he walked into the Loughlin Island bar, the Heights bar, and he fired 39 rounds in less than 3 seconds, taking the lives of 6 men, as Nola said, and injuring several others.
I'm not going to dare to ask you about the history of the UVF because I'm afraid you'll start at 1914.
It's actually before that, but yeah.
I will just say myself that there is a long history of involvement of soldiers and members of the security forces with the UVF, and while there are disputes about whether the contemporary UVF represents the UVF of 1914, that is the reality of the legacy that they claim for themselves. So the fact that Ronnie Hawthorne was a member of the security forces was actually very typical of the UVF at that time, wasn't it? There were a lot of other people who were involved with the police reserve, with the UDR, and with the TA and with other elements of the security forces. But that, as it emerged, is actually one of the very shocking things about it, isn't it? That the very people who were supposed to be keeping the peace were actually deeply involved with horrendous murders. I mean, when did you start to realise the full horror of the Loughlin Island story when you began to investigate it?
Probably when Barry McCaffrey came to work for us.
Yeah.
It's quite a moment. But yeah.
Barry had worked on the story when he was in the Down Recorder,
Yep.
isn't that right?
Yep.
Quite soon after the atrocity.
Yeah, and Barry came to work with me. I'd known Barry before, but when he came to work for the Detail in 2011, he had a number of stories he wanted to pursue, but one of them was Loughlin Island. And at that stage, the families had launched a campaign, but really the campaign had ebbed and flowed. Niall Murphy, my friend and lawyer, he was looking after them and trying to deal with the Ombudsman's office, who was at that stage under the auspices of Al Hutchison, a Canadian Mountie who really produced a report that the families just could not accept. And in one night they pursued Al Hutchison in his offices in a meeting, and ultimately the report was overturned. I'm now starting to
Paraphrase.
Yes. For half of everything, sort of it's short in the winter here. But so there was incredible work that had been done from Niall. Barry then started to talk to the relatives about going public on what had happened to them, and their concerns and their fears that really there was collusion at the heart of this attack. So that produced a series of reports, and then I happened to be working with an American director at the time called Alex Gibney, and we'd been involved in a documentary called Mea Maxima Culpa, which was about sex abuse in the Catholic Church globally, but particularly in America. And I talked to Alex one afternoon about the work that Barry was doing, about the story, and he immediately was interested. It was just before the World Cup in 2014 in South Africa, the Soccer World Cup, and we produced a short documentary called Ceasefire Massacre, but we really felt that there was work undone, and we left that documentary and began to work on a film that ultimately became No Stone Unturned, which was completely and utterly driven by the work of Barry McCaffrey, but involved so many other people, Emer O'Neill, who's out there somewhere tonight, and so many others who worked along with us to make the film. But it was driven by Barry's journalism, and obviously the report that had been leaked to Barry by somebody who obviously was a very publicly minded individual. Barry had got this brown envelope that arrived in our offices, and when we saw that report, which was an unredacted ombudsman report that had been shared with the PSNI, but it was an unredacted report which revealed everything that was known about Loughlin Island. And at that stage, the kind of scales fell from our eyes. This was a journalist's dream in many ways, because it gave us the facts that was known to the state. And from that point on, we knew what we were going to do. Naming names and deciding to reveal suspects is always something that journalists are always going to worry about, because trial by media and all of that, and there's been a lot of that which has been very controversial here in Northern Ireland. But actually we decided that we were going to name the individuals, and we were going to name Ronnie Hawthorne's wife, because we felt at that stage, going back to your previous question, very important, because collusion was seen as a political issue, nebulous. How do you actually show collusion? Everyone talks about collusion, but how do you? And we felt that it was important that actually you're going to have to name names here, and we have to show exactly what collusion looks like. And that's what we felt that No Stone Unturned showed and proved, the level of collusion there was, between this fluid situation between the security forces, part-time UDR officers going in to get security briefings while wearing the uniform, and they'd go outside, taking the uniform off and putting on balaclavas, but with the actual briefings that they'd been given. And that's what Ronnie Hawthorne was found with in Clock Orange Hall. He had weapons, and he had all the briefings that he'd been given, the documents he'd been given while being a member of the UDR, and so many others. And he was using those to select targets.
Yeah, I think it's worth reminding people at this point as well that the title of the documentary, No Stone Unturned, came from something that was said to members of the Loughlin Island families, which was by the police at the time. They said there will be no stone unturned
and so
in this
many
investigation.
Others, yeah.
And that had been said, of course, to many, many other people. And then Claire Rogan, who was one of the people bereaved by the atrocity, had said to you in the documentary, I don't think they even lifted a stone, let alone looked underneath it, which is a very profound and shocking insight into exactly what then followed. So that what then happened was, instead of there being an investigation as such, the whole thing was just let drift, wasn't it? And really it was then left to journalists like Barry and others to keep on looking and keep on listening and to take the story forward. So you then brought out No Stone Unturned, which definitively showed the collusion and what had happened and so on, and the outrage it was that the evidence which was available had not been used to jail those responsible. And then the story got really weird, didn't it? Because you suddenly then became part of the story, which is something that, in fairness, journalists don't want to be.
No.
And I must say at this point that I think one of the things that's very impressive about this book is that although Barry and Trevor became part of the story, they do keep their modesty in relation to their role in this book. I mean, they don't try to make it about them. They became part of the story, but they use that in a way which actually illuminates the whole scenario of what was going on, and sees what happens to them as being an extension of what was done to the families. but I'd like you to talk to us about the politics of that, like how you perceive. First of all, just very briefly tell people what happened to yourselves.
Yeah.
And we should really have Sheila, Barry's or Trevor's
Sheila's there,
wife, to come up
yeah.
here and tell us about this, because she seems to have handled it in the family. But just briefly what happened to you, but also then what emerged from that and what you think it means in terms of how the authorities treated journalism in the context of this whole sort of scenario of atrocities that were not investigated.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you put yourself in Claire Rogan's shoes, 2 young children, and police officers keep coming to your door and saying, "Don't you worry, we will leave no stone unturned," and that did become imprinted on Claire's brain, that as she tried to raise her family, she tried to survive without her husband Frosty. She believed at some point there was going to be a moment of cathartic justice, not only for her but for everyone else. So can you put yourself in the shoes of Claire when she realised that was a callous thing to say to her? A promise that had no commitment, that there was nothing behind that. You know, it's like somebody said to me, it was tea and sympathy. You know, just go to the relatives, sit with them, drink their tea, take their biscuits and give them sympathy. But these officers were giving hope and were promising and committing to something that Dr. Michael Maguire in his report on Loughlin Island in 2016 found was completely unfounded.
Yeah, his words were incompetence, indifference and neglect. That was how he described the investigation.
And so whenever we got the chance to speak with the families and with Barry and Emer and others who spoke with the families, we realised that that had caused an immense sense of hurt, not only on top of the fact that they'd lost husbands and brothers and fathers and uncles, but they were promised something. And you know, rural people experience the conflict very different than urban people, I think. And coming from Fermanagh, I could understand, because you know, these are come from a farming community where farmers help each other and loan tractors to each other, and it's a community that doesn't have the peace walls of North and West Belfast. There are many invisible walls of sectarianism, but the communities get on much more because the conflict seemed to be something that happened somewhere else. And that was very true of those families, and I do believe they trusted the RUC. They absolutely trusted the RUC to give them the justice. So when we started to tell the story and brought out the film, I think the families were, first of all, what Dr. Michael Maguire did in his report, Ombudsman report in 2016, and you can see in the film what it meant to Emma Rogan when she burst into tears at that release of knowing that they weren't crazy, they weren't mad, they weren't conspiracy theorists, there was collusion. And the film then simply built on that. As I say, the challenge was to go further than, and journalistically Dr. Martin Maguire knew that we were going to do that. He knew always that journalism had a role, just as he had a role. But yeah, what I can't understand is that somewhere within the PSNI headquarters, not far from here, there was a group of individuals who got together and decided to watch the film. Probably in the room that I'd been in several months before the release, were quite controversially, and there were some people not too far away from me were quite worried by what I did. But in April 2017, 6 months before the film came out, I asked for a meeting with an Assistant Chief Constable, Stephen Martin, and I went to him and met him in this long kind of, almost like a Russian wall. You know, you imagine what you think that something inside the Kremlin looks like, wooden walls, and Mr. Martin positioned himself at the long end of this table that seemed to stretch from here to Kevin Winters away, and we talked, and I said, well, I'm here because we're going to do something, and I want you to know it, and I want you, I'm a journalist, you're a policeman, You've got to decide what you're going to do. We're going to name the people who are the chief suspects, and we know that they are the chief suspects. They were the chief suspects in the day after the attack, and they remain the chief suspects, and we're going to name them. Now, it's up to you to take whatever action you want to take, and that could be to injunct the film. He could have decided that I was, or what Barry and I and Alex and everybody else involved were going to put these lives in danger. He could have injuncted the film, and he said, no, you do what you need to do, we'll do what we have to do, leave it with us, thank you very much. And we were like, 6 months later when the film went out, in that same room I mentioned, the wheeled into television and watched No Stone Unturned and went, oh my God, this is horrific, this is terrible. What are we going to do about this? And somebody in that meeting said, well, quite clearly what we're going to do is going to arrest the journalists. We're not going to go after the people who carried out the slaughter of 6 men, were involved in the murders of numerous others. We're going to arrest the journalists because they've been in possession of pieces of A4 paper that we feel that shouldn't be in their hands, and now they've put it on a film that's going around the world. So, and that's, can you imagine how the moral compass within the upper echelons of the BSNI was completely lost?
But it's kind of even worse than that, isn't it? Because it's also that they did so at the behest of the killers. That they came after you because they said that you had put lives at risk, and those lives were apparently the lives of those who had carried out the atrocity.
Well, even worse than that, Susan, what they said then, they all sat around in that room and said, well, what could we get these damn journalists on? And somebody said, well, we'll get them for theft of the document. And right, okay, we'll get them for theft of the document. Well, what about the Official Secrets Act? They must have breached the Official Secrets Act here. And then under the Official Secrets Act, you have to prove harm. You just can't breach Official Secrets Act. You have caused harm. And in that room they said, well, who's harm? What harm did they cause, these guys? And somebody said, well, they've named that guy Ronnie Horton. He's got a rat extermination business. I wonder what that's going like. And they sent police officers to Ronnie Horton, the chief suspect in Loughinisland, to take a statement from him. And Ronnie Horton sat there and gave a statement saying, oh, this has been terrible. This film has caused me untold harm. I can't go to Belfast now to kill rats, and I can't hire any. Nobody will hire me anymore. This is terrible. It's shocking what has happened to me. And I hope you do something about it. And they said, oh, don't worry, Mr. Horton, we'll go off and do something about it. And then on the 31st of August 2018, on a day that myself, Sheila, and the girls were preparing to for a weekend with our family from London had come in, and there was a load of children, and you can imagine it's just like any other house. There's plenty of beds, but all the kids end up sleeping in one bed, and there was a large knock. I'm completely deaf, so I heard nothing, I have to say. When the knock did come to the door, it was Sheila told me there was a knock at the door, and she narrated what you could see as she opened the blinds and could look outside, and she says, oh, there's a lot of cars outside, and there's a lot of police cars. And I was going, like, a lot of police cars, then you think, oh, something's happened. And I remember looking around to me and going, what's that about? And thankfully, in my head, I remember the words of Niall Murphy on the very night that we premiered the film in Belfast, because on that day, Stephen Martin, the man had taken the meeting several months before, in October 2017, he had announced that he was conducting an investigation into the leak of the document. So I tried to reassure Sheila I haven't got some sort of alter life and hadn't been, there was nothing else that could possibly, the police could arrive at my door for. And I said, listen, this is about Loughinisland, it's no stone unturned. And I went downstairs, and the police officer said that he was going to search my house. And I thought, oh, we're okay. Well, if that's what it's about, well, then there's nothing here that you're going to find. And then another police officer took me into another room and said, actually, I'm arresting you under the Official Secrets Act and everything else. And I didn't know at all what was happening across the city with Barry until...
Yeah, I remember interviewing Barry and him saying about, just the feeling of shame and, going out and being taken out into the street by armed police, and a neighbour, a lady out with her dog, seeing this and sort of thinking, and him realising that she would be thinking, what has he done? We thought he was a nice wee lad. Now look what's happened.
No,
It's always the quiet ones, But I have to say also the book does include some very funny moments, strangely, and one of them is that when Barry's house was being raided, he decided that as he was a law-abiding citizen, he was going to behave like one, and he offered a cup of tea to the armed police officers who had just entered his house to arrest him, which...
Ours weren't, she didn't offer any tea.
No. But just moving on then to the politics of what
Yes.
happened, because you then found yourself in the middle of a huge legal battle, which, as your friend, I remember you being intensely anxious about, because there were huge financial stakes as well as everything else, weren't there? But you'll have to go quickly, unfortunately, because we're running out of time, and you've been an incredibly difficult interviewee.
I'm very proud of that.
So if you could, yeah. So just tell us about the politics of what followed, and what you now think was going on with your arrest and Barry's arrest.
Yeah.
What was that about? Why did that happen?
Well, I mean, when I left the house, my daughter Mia somehow had Niall Murphy's number. Don't ask me how Mia had Niall Murphy's daughter. She was barely 16 at the time, but she alerted Niall Murphy, and Niall Murphy turned up at Musgrave Police Station, or the terrace suite that myself and Barry were being held in, and he brought me into a room, or I was taken out of the cell and brought to a room to meet Niall, and Niall said, listen, you know, we've had a look at this. Joe McVeigh, who's here tonight, his colleague, and Stephen Toll, the barrister, have been to your office has been raided, and you do know Barry. And I could see, when I was led down the terrace suite, I could saw these pair of walking boots at the cell next to mine, and I immediately knew they were Barry McCaffrey's boots, and I kind of went, and there was, I have to say there was a sense of relief that it was Barry McCaffrey. And as I've said before, if you're ever going to be arrested with someone, I highly recommend Barry as someone to be arrested with. The best person in the world.
Enough, Barry, on the other hand, refers to both of you at this period as us clowns, us pair of clowns.
Clowns,
Anyway,
Barry has a special way with words, but I was sort of, and anyway, I brought up to see Niall, and Niall sat me down and said, listen, you've got to seriously listen, and you can imagine a million things going through your head about what exactly has happened to you, and what was going on with Barry, and what was happening to everybody else, and what my mother in Enniskillen was thinking, and what was going on at the house. And he says, listen, okay, we've got grounds for a judicial review, we can go into court immediately, and you know, we could get the searches stopped, we could get all of that, and there could be a real benefit to this. But you've got to understand the downside to this decision, and that is, if we lose this judicial review, you personally will be bankrupt. Mm-hmm. You will lose everything, because the police costs will have to be paid. Every agency that becomes involved in this, the court, everybody's going to have to pay it, and the costs are going to run into a huge amount of money. But you know, do you want to roll the dice? You know, Joe McVeigh thinks it's the right idea, you know, and do you want to roll the dice? And I can't remember whether it was went back to the cell and come back to Barry, or come back to Niall, but anyway, I did decide to roll the dice and say, okay, go for it. And that was a very, you know, that's the important for journalists to have good solicitors behind you, and that was an incredibly important, incisive move by Niall and all his colleagues, that they see we can get into court. They went into court. The Lord Chief Justice did give them granted them leave to appeal the decision to grant us the warrant that came as shooting crows from the judge that had given the police the warrant to arrest us and to raid our homes and the offices. And I think, and after that, we were on this sort of roller coaster.
Well, actually, tell us about the title of the book, because that's relevant to this, isn't it?
Yep.
Shooting Crows. Tell us where Shooting Crows comes from.
Well, Shooting Crows is kind of a double entendre. The first and foremost, it comes from a hearing, what's called an ex-party hearing, which basically means that we weren't allowed into it. But on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks before our arrest, PSNI officers, not Durham officers, PSNI officers went into a court on a Friday afternoon, a high court. You can imagine it was a very quiet place on a Friday afternoon in August. And they went into a court and they sat in front of a Judge Rafferty, and they basically lied to him. And what they said was, there's these really two bad boys, and what we need to do is arrest them, because if we ask them to cooperate, they've shown that they will not cooperate, particularly that boy McCaffrey, because you know there was a previous leak inquiry, and he through a solicitor called Joe Rice had written back to us to say, thanks very much, but no thanks, I'm not going to cooperate. That proves that what we need to do is arrest them and raid their homes. And Judge Rafferty turned around there and he was, in an Ox Party hearing, a judge is supposed to actually be the party that's not in court. He's meant to consider what the people that you want the action against may say in this situation. And of course he didn't do that at all. But what he did say was, is this a case where you're trying to shoot a couple of crows in a field in order to scare some other crows out of that field? The police go, no, absolutely not. And I think it was one of the few, if only, perceptive comments that Rafferty made in that hearing. And really what he said was, so what you're doing is you're going to send a chill factor within journalism. You're going to send a chill factor within the legal world in Belfast. And what did you going to send to any public servant out there who's thinking of leaking a document? What you're sending a message through these requests is, do not leak documents. And if you get leaked documents, do not put them into the public domain. Or what happened to Birney McCaffrey is going to say. And the police basically went, yes, that's what we're going to do. And I think that, in terms of the political question, fits into a wider grand spectrum. And that grand spectrum is that the British government is determined not to give truth to victims. It doesn't matter who the victims are. It doesn't matter whether they're Enniskillen victims or the Loughin Island victims. They do not want to give truth to victims about their knowledge role in this conflict. So there's been a dominant narrative that's been created about the conflict that terrorists were bad, they were all bad, the IRA were bad, the loyalists were bad, the RUC tried to uphold the rule of law. Of course there were a few bad apples in there, but we, the British state, rose above all this, and we had absolutely nothing to do with this. We were just trying to referee and keep everybody apart, when in fact that is as far from the truth that you could possibly believe. And Loughin Island.
Well said, Trevor, well said.
And what Loughin Island, and what No Stone Unturned, and what the work of Barry McCaffrey challenged was that narrative. And obviously, quite clearly, the politics was, and we now know it was Retired Police Officers Association, who tried to bring down Michael Maguire, who tried to overturn his report, were seeing a way of getting at myself and Barry, was their way of trying to challenge the narrative. Alternative narrative was, no, you absolutely knew that these people were killers in Southdown. You absolutely knew that they had access to V58s. You absolutely knew that they'd killed before, and you absolutely knew that they were going to kill again in Loughin Island. And that is a different narrative than your narrative. And I'm sorry, but that is the truth, and the documents we had proved that. And I think that was the politics of it. And the moral compass that was lost in that room in the PSNI was not really just a mad, crazy decision to arrest journalists. It was taken with that backdrop. Let's prevent the truth coming out about what actually happened in the conflict. It was a conflict that we absolutely were involved in as the British state. We absolutely did have informers. We knew that victims were expendable on this bigger picture. And we do not want journalists going there. So let's send a message to them that if you do tell these stories, you can expect the police to come through your door at 7 a.m. one morning. And that is the political backdrop. And I think that everything that has happened to bring it up to date, and the IPT and the investigation, look at what we've discovered, in the IPT. We met with a lawyer, an incredible lawyer in London called Ben Jaffe, when Barry had been instigated this complaint to the IPT, which basically said,
You better tell people what the IPT is.
So the Investigatory Powers Tribunal sits at a court number 72 at the very, very back of the Royal Courts of Justice in London. There isn't another court 73. This is it. You go through these incredible doors, and you go through this labyrinth of corridors, and you get up to court 72. That's with the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, which is it's a court that basically examines any complaints that you have about did any part of the British state surveil you, intercept your phone, tap your phone, all of that. And Barry, with support of others, had said, listen, let's lodge a complaint about what happened to us. So that complaint, we got an email in March 2023 to say, oh, we found something, can we're going to disclose some information to you. And that was 5 years after the complaint had been made. No, sorry, 4 years after the complaint had been made. And out of that email, which was the day before St. Patrick's Day 2023, has revealed this pull back the curtain. I don't think it's fully back, but it's pulled back the curtain on this dragnet operation that has been in place at the PSNI, not only against journalists, but also against activists and human rights organisations and lawyers. And basically they have been monitoring the telephones and monitoring the communications of journalists going back many, many years. And there is a thing called a McCullough Review that's out there at the minute, and that is looking at all this. But I do think that everything we've found is really going back to that same culture, and that culture is do not give truth, protect the dominant narrative, do not give any quarter to anyone who challenges that, whether it be a lawyer, a human rights lawyer, whether it be a journalist, and protect at all costs. And I've no doubt that the arrest of myself and Barry has caused huge problems for the PSNI. Quite rightly, they've had reputational damage, they've paid us costs and damages and legal fees, but that was visited on me and Barry. We did not go out and seek that, and that's very important. They visited us, they came to our door, they brought this to our door, and only through the incredible legal work and the colleagues around us have we been able to push back and find out, this hornet's nest that has been there at the very centre of the PSNI and going right back to the REC.
Whew. Thank you very much, Trevor. We've gone over time, but I think it was well worth it. But there are still some things that Trevor has not managed to tell you which are contained within this book, and it's very well worth your while buying it. And I suspect that there may well end up having to be a sequel, because this isn't over yet. There's still court cases ongoing, and but it's a fantastic book, and it's a huge credit to, Trevor keeps talking about you need good editors, you need good lawyers, you need good friends, you need good family, but overwhelmingly you need to be a bloody good journalist. And this is a book written by a bloody good journalist, and there aren't very many of them. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope that everybody could hear at least part of the conversation.
Yes, thank you very much for coming.